The Many Murders of Toss Gang is not a story about a crew that won a war. It's a story about a crew that keeps burying its own people while its frontman sits in front of cameras and talks about killing like it's nothing. We all know how Chicago has been getting busy and how many people die from gun violence every year. But this gang is different. Right now, there's a young man from the west side of Chicago named Devin Meeks. The world knows him as Von Off 1700. And he has done something almost nobody in rap is reckless enough to do. He has gone on camera, podcast after podcast, interview after interview, and all but confessed to murder. Not subliminally. Not in a bar you have to rewind 3 times to catch. Out loud. He sat across from interviewers and said that if he tells you he killed somebody, and then it just so happens a news article pops up about a body, what are they going to do? Lock him up because he said it? He's let people ask him point blank if he's a paid hitman. And instead of denying it, he leans back, says he's not telling you nothing, and lets the silence say the rest. That's a man daring the state to come get him. On tape. For free. And here's what really went down. The part this story has been building toward. For all that talk about who Toss is killing, the bodies that are actually confirmed, the ones you can pull up in Chicago news reports right now, aren't ops. They're Toss' own dead. In a span of about 6 weeks in the summer of 2024, this one little gang lost 3 people. One friend gone off fake pills around the same week as Von's own birthday. A 19-year-old named Moo Money shot dead. His body left outside the doors of a hospital because the people in the car couldn't carry him inside without catching a case themselves. And not 2 weeks after that, a 13-year-old boy shot in the head on a sidewalk in North Lawndale, killed by shooters who police say were teenagers themselves. 3 deaths. 1 season. 1 gang. And the man at the front of it was on the internet the whole time, telling the world nobody could touch him. So when we say the Many Murders of Toss Gang, understand exactly what's being put on the table. This is not a claim that Von 1700 caught a body. The courts never proved that, and neither will this. What's being said is something that sits heavier than that. This is about a gang that turned death into a brand. A frontman who treats a murder charge like a marketing plan, and a graveyard that keeps filling up with his friends while he records the next song about how he's winning. This is the west side of Chicago. This is Toss. And this is what really happens when a teenager decides the realest thing he can sell is his own funeral. By the time we get to the end of this, you're going to understand why this gang calls itself the most hated in the city, and why most hated and most buried have quietly started to mean the exact same thing. You're going to understand where this whole set comes from. A bloodline that runs back more than 50 years before Von was ever born. You're going to understand the block-by-block math that turns the west side into a place where your enemy lives close enough to see from your porch. And you're going to understand the trap at the center of all of it. The one where the same words that built the career are the same words that end it. Let me break it down from the very beginning. Von Off 1700 was supposed to be one of the good outcomes. That's the part nobody frames right. So let me put it up front. This is a kid who, on paper, did the exact thing everybody in the neighborhood tells you to do. He took the pain and the chaos around him and turned it into music. And the music actually worked. He dropped his first real record, Walk Down, back in July of 2020 when he was 17 years old. He hit again with Ops on Deck, riding the Gucci Made on Deck beat. And that one took off on TikTok with thousands of people making videos to it, racking up millions of plays. He built a catalog. Free Brick, The Whole Number, Free My Hood, Your Hood Run. The cosigns started rolling in from people who actually move the needle. G Herbo, Polo G, Sexy Red. He linked with the California EBK wave, showing up on records with EBK Jabo, and that whole camp. And then came the one that's supposed to be the finish line, a major label deal with Columbia Records. From a sidewalk on the west side to a major in about 4 years. That is not nothing. That is the dream they sell every kid in that neighborhood. Get on, get out, get the family up. By that scoreboard, Von won. But here's the contradiction, and it's the whole reason this story matters. The same authenticity that got him signed is the authenticity that's burying everybody around him. The label didn't sign him in spite of the war. The label signed him because of the war. The streets he's rapping about are real streets with real ops a block away and real funerals on the calendar. The product is the pain, and you cannot sell that product without staying in the exact environment that produces the bodies. So Von's rise didn't pull him out of the life. It locked him deeper into it. Because now the life is the brand, and walking away from the life means walking away from the brand. The check is tied to the chaos. You stop being in danger. You stop being authentic. You stop being marketable. That's the trap this entire story is about. And it's bigger than one rapper. It's the engine the whole modern drill economy runs on. And the cost of that engine isn't abstract. It didn't just put a couple of guys on house arrest. It's cost his crew its children. And that's meant as plainly as it sounds. Here's why Toss is worth a full breakdown and not just a clip. A lot of these gang rap stories are messy on purpose, built on rumors and subliminals nobody can verify. This one is different because the main character keeps telling on himself in his own words, on camera. And unlike a lot of internet myths, the deaths attached to this story are real, documented, and reported by Chicago News. You don't have to take a YouTube comment's word for it. So there's something rare here, the ability to separate what's actually true from what's just talk. And the gap between those two things turns out to be the realest part of the whole story. To understand how Toss got to that summer of 2024, to understand how a 22-year-old with a Columbia deal ends up connected to 3 graves in 6 weeks, we have to go all the way back. Back before Vaughn. Back before the TikToks and the label money. Back to a gang that was born on the west side of Chicago more than half a century ago, built from day one on one thing: protecting a few blocks by any means necessary. Let's rewind. Most people who talk about Chicago drill get this part dead wrong. When the world thinks Chicago gangs, the world thinks South Side. Black disciples, gangster disciples, O-Block, the whole machine the planet learned about through King Von and Lil Durk. That's the South and East Side world. Toss is not that. Toss is West Side. And that distinction is the entire foundation of who they are. Different bloodline, different history, different rules. Their roots run back to a gang called the Four Corner Hustlers. And to understand the Four Corner Hustlers, you have to go back to West Garfield Park in the late 1960s. The gang was founded there around 1968 by 2 young men named Walter Wheat, who they called King Wheat, and Freddie Gage. Here's a detail that matters. When they started, the Four Corner Hustlers weren't even a drug gang. By early accounts, they came up as a fighting gang, a self-protection effort. Less than 10 dudes trying to hold a narrow strip of West Garfield Park turf against outside crews who wanted to run drugs and violence through their blocks. In the beginning, drug dealing was actually forbidden inside the gang. They wore black and brown. They were small, tight, and local. Now think about what was happening around them. West Garfield Park in the 1960s was a neighborhood in freefall. It had been a white community that was rapidly changing as black families moved in. As that happened, white businesses fled, money drained out, and the whole economic foundation of the West Side started collapsing. The 1968 riots after Drive King's assassination tore through these neighborhoods and gutted what was left. So the Four Corner Hustlers weren't born in a vacuum. They were born in the wreckage. A few kids trying to hold a corner together while the city around them fell apart, and nobody in power lifted a finger to stop it. That's the soil. Abandonment first, gang second. Always in that order. Over time, the Fours got pulled into the bigger Chicago gang structure. They allied with the Vice Lords, and that alliance became part of what's known as People Nation, one of the 2 giant umbrella alliances that organized Chicago gangs. On the other side was Folk Nation, and the flagship Folk Nation gang is the Gangster Disciples. So the rivalry that defines so much of this, people versus folk, for corner hustlers versus Gangster Disciples, that's a decades-old structural beef baked into the city's bones. And it's not random that the GDs grew in the same West Side soil. The Supreme Gangsters, who became the Gangster Disciples, were recruiting in West Garfield Park in 1967, the same window the Fours were forming. These crews grew up clashing over the same broke blocks. The hatred is older than anybody currently holding it. The Four Corner Hustlers grew into one of the most violent and feared organizations on the West Side. They expanded out of West Garfield Park into Austin, into North Lawndale, and eventually way past Chicago, into Memphis, Detroit, Atlanta, the Carolinas. They even produced a famous name. Most people don't connect to any of this. The rapper Common came out of the Four Corner Hustler orbit before he was Common, the conscious rap icon. This is a serious, deep-rooted institution with a real history, not some new internet thing. But here's the turn that produces Toss. As the original founders aged out, died, got locked up, got old, the gang fractured. The old structure broke down, and the younger generation did what younger generations always do. They made their own subsets, their own little crews named after their own specific blocks, scattered across the west side. Dozens of them. Some leaning more four-corner hustler, some with gangster disciple in the mix. And the old colors and codes mean less and less with every generation. TOS, repping 1400, 500, and 1700, with roots in what they call L Block, is one of those younger branches. The great-grandchildren of Walter Wheat's Little Fighting Gang. Except now the fighting is filmed and uploaded. And here's something worth saying out loud, because it's part of why a crew like TOS can rack up this much tragedy without the wider world ever really clocking it. The west side of Chicago has always been the city's overlooked half. When the documentaries get made, when the famous names break, when the world tunes into Chirac, it's almost always the south side. O Block, Englewood, the Black Disciples, the Gangster Disciples, the names King Von and Dirk and Chief Keef carried around the planet. The south side became the face of Chicago drill. And the west side became the part nobody outside the city could name. Even within Chicago, the west side gets treated like the quieter, smaller story. Which is wild, because the violence over there is every bit as old and every bit as deadly. It's just less famous. That matters for this story in a real way. When a south side situation pops off, there's a whole ecosystem ready to cover it. Blogs, channels, documentaries, the works. When a west side kid like Moo Money gets killed, the reporting is thin, the coverage fades in a day, and the only people really keeping the record are the rappers themselves and their songs and a handful of channels willing to do the digging. That's part of why TOS leans so hard into the most hated branding in the first place. When the city spotlight is pointed at the other side of town, being the loudest, most hated, most talked about set becomes a way to make people look. The branding isn't just ego. It's a west side crew fighting for oxygen in a story the world keeps telling about the south side. So understand where TOS actually sits. They're the descendants of one of the most feared organizations the west side ever produced, operating in neighborhoods, West Garfield Park, North Lawndale, that have been bleeding since before drill had a name. In a part of the city the cameras mostly skipped. Vonoff 1700 didn't just have to survive the war. He had to be loud enough to make a distracted internet pay attention to a side of Chicago it usually ignores. And he was. That's the skill nobody gives him credit for, buried under all the murder talk. He made the world look at the west side. The cost of making them look was showing them the bodies. Now here's the single most important thing to understand about the modern version of this. The old lineage barely matters anymore. Back in the day, who you descended from told you exactly who your enemies were and who your family was. People Nation didn't beef People Nation. You knew your alliances. Now most of these younger sets claim EBK, everybody killer. That phrase means precisely what it says. They will go to war with crews that rep the same faction they came from. Same roots, same umbrella, same paperwork on some bureaucratic gang charge somewhere, and still shooting at each other. So the fact that TOS came off the four-corner hustlers doesn't protect them from a single thing. Their war with Black Mob, one of their main rivals, is a war with another crew that came off the same original four-corner hustler tree. Same bloodline. Cousins, basically, in gang terms. And they'll kill each other quicker than they'd kill a total stranger. Because in the EBK era, there is no we used to be one. There's only this block versus that block, right now, today. That's the world TOS lives in. A gang founded 50-plus years ago to protect a few blocks, splintered into a set that'll fight anybody, even its own bloodline. In a city where the old alliances mean nothing, and the only thing that means everything is proximity. Who's close? Who's a block away? Hold on to that idea, because it's about to become the difference between life and death in this story. Before we get to Vaughn himself, you have to understand the genre he was born into, because the genre is half the murder weapon in this whole story. Chicago drill didn't exist when the four-corner hustlers were founded. It exploded out of the South Side around 2011 and 2012 when a teenager named Chief Keef put out I Don't Like and Love Sosa and basically invented a whole sound and a whole template overnight. Dark, minimal beats, flat menacing delivery, and lyrics that didn't tell stories so much as report the weather of the block. Who got hit? Who's an op? What happens when you slide? Keef was a kid from O Block on house arrest, filming videos in his grandma's crib. Within a year, He had a major label deal and the entire industry flying to Chicago. That was the blueprint. Pain plus a phone plus a beat equals a way out. Or at least the promise of one. Here's what made drill different from every gangster rap that came before it, and why it's so much more dangerous to the people making it. Old gangster rap was mostly stories, sometimes true, often exaggerated, performed by grown men looking back. Drill collapsed the distance between the song and the street to almost zero. The kid rapping about an op is often actively beefing with that op that week. The video gets filmed on the actual block. The song names actual people, sometimes dead people, by their actual names. And then it all gets uploaded to YouTube and Instagram, where the ops watch it in real time and respond, not with a diss track, but sometimes with a gun. Drill turned neighborhood beef into content, and turned content back into neighborhood beef in a loop with no breaks. The song doesn't just describe the war. The song is a move in the war. And it went global off that. London drill, Brooklyn drill, scenes in Australia, Ghana, France. The whole world copied the Chicago template. But the rest of the world mostly copied the sound. Chicago kept the body count. Because in Chicago, for a kid like Von off 1700 coming up a decade after Keefe, the formula had hardened into law. The realest story wins. Realness is measured in proximity to actual death. And the algorithm pays out in exact proportion to how much danger you're visibly standing in. So a West Side kid with an inherited 50-year-old war and a house full of grief wasn't just able to make drill. He was sitting on a gold mine of the exact raw material the genre demands. The tragedy was the asset. That's the machine Devin Meeks walked into. Now let's meet him. Devin D. Meeks was born April 22, 2003 and raised on the west side of Chicago. By his own accounts and interviews, he came up in a packed house, something like 10 siblings in a Christian household, with an older brother who raps too, Brick off 1700, who'd become one of his main collaborators. So the picture you should have in your head isn't some lone wolf monster. It's a big family, a crowded house, faith on the walls, and a neighborhood right outside the door that didn't care about any of that. Because the violence reached them early. This is the most important fact in his whole biography, and everything else makes sense once you have it. In an interview telling his life story, Von has said he watched his uncle get murdered when he was 8 years old. 8. Let that land. Before this kid could spell the word murder, it wasn't a concept to him. It was something he'd already seen happen to his own blood, in front of his own eyes. That is not a footnote. That is the wound the entire rest of this story grows out of. You don't see something like that at 8, and come out the other side neutral about death. It rewires you. And when we get to the part later where Von says he can never make peace because he lost family, not just friends, remember the 8-year-old. That moment never closed. It just got bigger as he grew. He had legal trouble young, too. He's talked in interviews about being on house arrest tied to a gun case before the music ever popped off. So by the time he's a teenager, he's already collected the full resume these neighborhoods hand out for free. A murdered relative, a gun case, an ankle monitor, and a hood at war on every side. And then he picked up a microphone. July 2020, 17 years old. Walk-down drops. His style was fast, aggressive, rapid-fire. Older ears compared him to West Side voices that came before him. But he had his own pocket, his own bounce. Then Ops on Deck hit TikTok riding the Gucci on Deck instrumental, and the numbers came flooding in. Thousands of user videos, millions of plays. And the thing that made it stick wasn't a gimmick or a dance. It was that everybody could feel he wasn't acting. The kid rapping about ops and walk-downs and dead homies was a kid who had actually buried people. That's the currency in this genre. Realness you can't fake. That's what the algorithm paid for, and what eventually made Columbia write the check. By 2024, he was sitting down with Vlad TV telling his whole come-up story, the 10 siblings, the uncle's murder, the gun case, the friends he lost, including one killed in a car theft-related situation, and explaining how all of that fed directly into his music, his lyrics, his videos. He wasn't hiding the pain. He was selling it openly as the source of the work. And he wasn't wrong that it was authentic. That's exactly the problem. But here's where it gets complicated. The music did not end the war. It put a spotlight on it. Now every op in the city knew his name, knew his face, knew his block, knew his routine. The bigger Von got, the bigger the target on all of TOS. Fame and drill is not an exit door. It's an amplifier turned all the way up. And by 2023 into 2024, that amplifier was screaming right as the bodies started to drop. To understand how loud it got, you have to understand the beef. So let's map it block by block. Here's what really went down with Toss beef. And you need to picture it like a literal map, because the geography is the whole horror of it. By Von's own telling, Toss' two biggest rivals are Same Gang and Black Mob. Now, in most cities, a rival is somebody across town. You'd have to get in a car, drive somewhere, go looking for trouble. Not here. Von has explained it himself when breaking things down. Same Gang sits about 1 block west. Black Mob sits about 1 block south. 1 block in either direction. Think about what that actually means in day-to-day life. Toss is boxed in. Their enemies aren't a destination you choose to go to. They're the neighbors you can't avoid. You could walk out your front door, stand on the wrong corner, and be staring straight into op territory without taking 10 full steps. There is no neutral ground when the war is being fought at a distance you could throw a rock across. Every trip to the store is a calculation. Every ride down the block is a risk. Every time somebody's outside on a nice day, the map itself is the threat. That's the part people outside Chicago genuinely cannot wrap their heads around. It's not that danger exists. It's that danger is next door, permanently, with no off switch. But 2 crews would almost be manageable. It's worse than that. By Von's account, Toss is into it with basically the entire west side. And the mechanism that turns 2 beefs into 20 is what they call clicking up. Let me break that down, because it's the single most important concept for understanding why these wars literally cannot end. When somebody dies, their crew grieves. And in that grief, they link up with another crew. Maybe the dead homie was tight with somebody from a different set. So now those 2 sets become one. And the moment one of those sets is your op, all of them are your op. One death doesn't just take a person off the board. It rewires the entire map. It folds new crews into the war. Lose one homie and his funeral can hand you 10 brand new enemies. Because everybody his people now stand with is somebody you now stand against. You see what that does? The war has a built-in engine that only adds. There is no subtraction anywhere in the system. Every death recruits. Every funeral expands the battlefield. Peace doesn't compound. Grief does. That's how a single set on a couple of blocks ends up at war with half a city. Not because they're that powerful, but because every loss multiplies the enemies. The math runs one direction only, and the direction it runs is toward more bodies, forever. Von put all of this on the mic, and he did not whisper any of it. He branded it. Toss leaned all the way into being the most hated set in the city, and Von himself never held back a day in his life. He's gone on Instagram Live and said flat out that Toss is killing Same Gang, not in code. There are clips where, with a producer sitting right there, he's basically announcing it directly. He's talked in interviews about his crew running through op territory, about taking no losses, about being into it with the whole west side, and being completely fine with that. Now, real talk, and this needs to be said clearly every single time so nobody watching gets it twisted. That's a man talking into a phone. That's bravado. That's the drill economy doing exactly what it's built to do, where the realest, hardest story wins the clout, and clout turns into streams, and streams turn into a check and a deal. Von saying we killing them on a live is not a courtroom confession the way people imagine. And it is absolutely not anyone claiming a specific named person died by a specific named hand. It's temperature. It tells you how hot the block runs. It tells you a young man decided that the most marketable version of himself is the one who sounds the most dangerous in the room. But here's the part that complicates the whole untouchable, most hated branding. The part the trolls feast on. The other side doesn't always play along with his script. There's a moment where an older Black Mob OG got on Facebook and took Von's entire gangster posture apart in about 3 sentences. The OG told Von that he was a toddler when this beef actually started. Said the war had mostly died down already. And he questioned Von's credentials straight to his face. Said none of his so-called ops even really know who he is. Sit with how brutal that is. This is a veteran of the actual streets, somebody who was in it when it was genuinely hot, telling a young rapper that he's cosplaying a war that was already cooling off before he was old enough to hold a gun. That he's loud about. A beef he inherited, not one he built. That half the most hated branding is a performance for an online audience. And that tension right there is the real engine of this whole section. On one side, you've got Von selling the war as live, deadly, ongoing, with himself at the dead center of it. On the other side, you've got an OG saying half of it is a kid talking loud about something that was already fading. And the wild thing is both can be true at the same time. The war is real enough to kill people. We're about to count them. And Vaughn's personal role in it might be more microphone than trigger. The streets are messy like that. The internet wants one clean villain and one clean truth. The actual reality is a 20-year-old who inherited a 50-year-old beef, amplified it for content because content pays, and then watched it take his friends anyway, whether or not he ever pulled a trigger himself. Because here's the thing about talking that hot on the internet. The thing Vaughn might not have fully weighed at 19. The ops are watching too. Every "we killing you" live. Every taunt. Every flex about running through somebody's hood. That's not just marketing aimed at fans. That's a message received by people who live a block away and have guns of their own and grief of their own. You could argue all day about whether Vaughn ever personally did anything. What is not up for argument is that the noise has consequences in the real world. When you spend years announcing that you're the most hated set in the city tends to take you up on it. The phone is part of the weapon. Let me add one more layer to the geography, because the block math alone doesn't fully explain why this generation's wars burn hotter than their fathers did. It's the phone. Back when the original four-corner hustlers were beefing the gangster disciples in the 70s and 80s, a war could cool off naturally. People didn't see each other for a while. Tempers faded. An OG could broker something, and the heat would drop. There were gaps. There was distance. There was time for things to settle. The war could breathe. That release valve is gone now. With Instagram and TikTok and YouTube, the ops are in your pocket 24 hours a day. You see their posts. You see them flexing in the spot you consider yours. You see them dancing on the grave of somebody you loved. Literally, sometimes recording themselves at the grave site. You see an op laughing in a video the same week you buried a homie. And now it's 3 in the morning and you're staring at your phone with that image burned into you. The technology removed every cooling off period the old walls used to create. There's no distance anymore. There's no gap. The beef is live streaming in your hand every minute of every day, and it never stops feeding you reasons to go. So when Vaughn gets on live and says Toss is killing sane gang, that's not just a flex into the void. That clip lands directly in the pocket of a kid one block over who was already grieving, already armed, and now newly humiliated in front of an audience. And his response lands right back in Toss' pocket. The phones keep the wound open. The phones make sure nobody ever gets the silence they need to let it heal. That's what's genuinely new about this generation of the war. And it's a big part of why beef that an OG says should have died down keeps producing fresh bodies anyway. The old men remember when you could get a break from your enemies. These kids have never known a single day of it. That's the full picture of the escalation. 50 years of inherited hatred compressed onto a couple of blocks with no distance and no off switch. Broadcast through a phone that makes sure the rage never cools. And in the summer of 2024, all of that came down at once. This is the part of the story where everybody watching needs to slow all the way down, because this is where the talking stops and the dying starts. Out of respect for the people who actually got hurt, and their families who are real and still grieving right now, this is going to be delivered straight. No glorifying. No drama for the sake of drama. Just what happened and what the records actually show. Toss lost 3 people in roughly 6 weeks in the summer of 2024. Not ops. Their own. It started in May. One of Vaughn's close friends, referred to as Michael, lost his life. And this one wasn't a shooting at all. By the accounts out there, Michael died from an overdose. Fake Percocets, counterfeit pills, the kind that get pressed with fentanyl and sold looking exactly like the real thing. The kind that have been quietly killing young people in these neighborhoods in numbers that make the gang war look small by comparison. Let me put that in context because it matters. The thing actually doing the most killing in communities like this one isn't always a rival with a gun. It's the counterfeit pill. Fentanyl is so potent that a kid thinking he's taking a regular perk can be dead. Before morning. No op involved. No retaliation to film. No diss track to make about it. It's an invisible killer with no face to point a gun at. And the timing of Michael's death carried its own cruel weight. It happened around the same time as Vaughn's birthday. So the week that's supposed to be a celebration turned into a week with a funeral inside it. Let that be the very first crack in the untouchable armor. Before a single op did one thing that summer, Toss had already lost a man to the quiet killer that's taken more of these kids than every gun on the West Side combined. That's a part of this story the drill narrative never wants to put at the center, because there's no enemy to name and no revenge to promise. Just a dead young man and a batch of poison sold as something else. Then came June. And June is when the guns came back into it. One of Vaughn's best friends, a young man known as Moo Money, government named John Smith, was shot and killed in West Chicago. He was 19 years old. The reporting on it was thin, but per Chicago police accounts at the time, he was hit multiple times by a shooter who hadn't been identified. And here's the detail that tells you everything about the position this life forces on people. His friends drove him to Stroger Hospital and left his body outside the emergency room. Didn't carry him in, dropped him at the doors and went. Now, why would they do that? Why would you leave your best friend outside the door of a hospital instead of running him inside screaming for help? Because the read on the street, and it's a brutal but telling read, is that the other people in that car couldn't walk into an ER with a fresh shooting victim without risking getting charged themselves. Maybe there's a gun in the car. Maybe somebody's got warrants. Maybe just being a few young black men from a known set rolling up with a gunshot victim means a night of questions and a possible case nobody can afford. So a 19-year-old's last ride ended with the people who loved him having to choose between staying with him in his final moments and staying out of a cage. And they chose the cage-free option. Not because they didn't love him, because the system had already taught them, over and over, that loving him out loud in that exact moment could cost them their own freedom. Think about how broken a situation has to be for that to be the rational choice. That's not a gangster detail. That's an indictment of an entire setup. One where the hospital, the one place that's supposed to be safe, is also understood to be a trap. That's what these neighborhoods actually live inside. Moo Money was 19. He should have had decades. Instead, he had a sidewalk drop-off in a city that taught his friends to run. And then, not even 2 full weeks after Moo Money, came the one that should stop every single person watching this completely cold. On the evening of Friday, June 14th, 2024, a 13-year-old boy was shot in the head while standing on the sidewalk in the 1300 block of South Independence Boulevard in the North Lawndale neighborhood on the west side. It was around 8:30 at night. He was rushed to Stroger Hospital in critical condition. He did not make it. He was pronounced dead. His name was Darian Yovan Rags, 13 years old. According to witnesses, the boy had been outside with friends. By some accounts, they were playing with fireworks on the sidewalk, completely normal kid stuff at the start of summer, when somebody walked up and opened fire. Chicago police released surveillance footage and said they were searching for 3 persons of interest. And here's the gut punch buried inside the gut punch. Police described those 3 persons of interest as teenage boys or young men roughly 15 to 20 years old. Kids. The people sought in the killing of a 13-year-old were themselves barely older than the boy they're accused of killing. I have to be dead honest about something here, because this is exactly the spot where the internet runs way out ahead of the facts, and where false narratives about dead kids get built and never corrected. In the streets and on YouTube, this boy sometimes gets folded into the gang war narrative. But the police never said that. None of the Chicago news coverage, not ABC7, not CBS, not the local outlets that reported his death, tied Darian Yovan Rags to Toss Gang or named any gang motive at all. As far as the verified, on-the-record facts go, he is a 13-year-old child who was shot on a sidewalk at the start of summer, and the people sought for it were teenagers. Maybe there's a street connection the news never confirmed. Maybe there absolutely isn't. But branding a dead 13-year-old as a gang member to make the story tie up neatly is exactly the kind of thing that gets said about black kids the second they're killed. And it's exactly the kind of thing that's so often just not true. Branding him saves nobody and smears a child. What's true is this, and it's enough. A child is dead. Other children are wanted for it. And it happened in the same neighborhood, in the same handful of weeks. That toss was already burying its own. So put it all together. The summer of 2024 was not a war toss one. It was a 6-week stretch where a gang that brands itself as killers turned out to be the ones doing most of the dying. A friend lost to a pill. A 19-year-old lost to a gun and left at a hospital door. A 13-year-old gone in a neighborhood already drowning. And Toss should know that same weekend in Chicago was one of the most violent of the entire year, with that 13-year-old being just one name on a long and ugly list. The West Side wasn't bleeding from TOS enemies. It was just bleeding from every direction, the way it has been for decades, ever since the money left West Garfield Park and never came back. So the title says the many murders of TOS gang. Now you understand the real weight of those words. The confirmed bodies aren't trophies on TOS wall. They're TOS own friends, TOS own dead, and a child nobody ever proved had a thing to do with any of it. That's the real body count of this story. And the man at the front of it spent that entire summer telling the world he was untouchable. Let's talk about that man now, in his own words. Because that's where this goes from tragedy to something even harder to look at directly. The main witness against Vonoff 1700 is Vonoff 1700. Here's the wildest thing about trying to examine this situation. You barely have to do any work. He testifies on himself. This is a man who goes on camera and says things that, taken at face value, are confessions. He's openly talked in interviews about apparent killings. And he's laid out his actual reasoning for why he thinks he can get away with that, which is honestly one of the boldest and most dangerous legal theories you'll ever hear from somebody who never went to law school. His logic, in his own words, runs like this. If he sits right there and tells you he killed somebody, and then it just happens that a news article comes out about somebody getting shot, what can they actually charge him with? He said some words. They can't lock a man up just because he says something. That's the bet. That's the entire strategy. Talk is free. Words can't convict. And this needs to be broken down clearly, because young men keep making this bet, and young men keep losing everything behind it. Over the last decade, prosecutors have been putting rappers in prison using exactly this kind of material. Lyrics, videos, social media interviews. The biggest example is the YSL case in Atlanta. Young Thug, real name Jeffrey Williams, got indicted in 2022 along with more than 24 co-defendants under Georgia's RICO statute. And prosecutors literally used his rap lyrics as evidence. They argued the lyrics counted as overt acts inside a criminal conspiracy. Think about that. Bars from songs presented in court as proof of crimes. Tekashi 6ix9ine caught federal RICO charges in 2019 in a similar vein. And the thing about RICO is that you don't even have to be personally accused of pulling the trigger. The state just has to argue you were part of an ongoing criminal enterprise, and your music and your posts can be used to tie you to it. That's the trap. The realness that sells the records becomes the evidence that builds the case. This got so heavy that there's now an actual movement against it. Protect Black Art. And federal legislation, the Restoring Artistic Protection Act, written specifically to limit using somebody's creative expression as evidence against them. Critics have called the whole practice a racist double standard, pointing out that nobody drags a country singer into court over a murder ballad, but a black kid's drill lyrics get treated as a signed confession. Whether you think that's fair or not, and there's a real argument that it's deeply unfair, the cold fact remains. The system has spent 10 years getting better at turning what rappers say into prison time. So Vonoff 1700 is betting his freedom on a loophole the law has been actively slamming shut for years. Every week killing them live. Every interview where he flirts with confessing. Every clip where he won't deny being a hitman. In his mind, that's free marketing. In a prosecutor's filing cabinet, that's a deposit. The bill on that kind of talk doesn't always come right away. It comes years later, when somebody finally decides to open the file and play the clips back to a jury. Then it gets darker and more careful at the same time. In one interview, Von got pushed directly on whether he's essentially an assassin. The framing was that money gets involved, work gets done. And watch how he handles it, because it's revealing. He does not deny it cleanly. He says he's not telling you nothing. He dances right up to the line and lets the implications sit there on the table, on purpose, for everybody to see. And again, that is posture. That is the drill performance of being the most dangerous man in the building. This is not a claim that Vonoff 1700 is a contract killer. What is being said is that he sat in front of a camera and chose to let the world believe it. Because in this scene, the perception of being the killer is the product itself. The mystery is the marketing. He gets paid more for the silence than he ever would for a clear yes or a clear no. Because the silence lets every listener fill in the scariest possible version on their own. But think hard about what that means. He's monetizing the implication of being a hitman. He's turned maybe I kill people for money into a brand asset. And the only way that asset holds its value is if he stays in the world where it stays plausible. You can't sell "Maybe I'm an assassin" from a quiet condo in the suburbs. You sell it from the block where people actually die, which means staying on that block, which means the danger isn't a side effect of the brand. The danger is the brand. He's locked in. It's not all murder talk either. Vaughn got accused of stealing the car of another Chicago artist, Lil Zay Osama, an established name with real records and real numbers. And on No Jumper, Adam 22 asked him straight up, "Did you steal Lil Zay Osama's car?" Now watch the footwork in his answer, because it's the exact same footwork from the murder talk, just in the other direction. He says, "Not me personally, somebody I be with." His account is that his guys used to boost cars as a regular hustle, and that Lil Zay's car wasn't even taken because Lil Zay was an op. It was just a nice whip sitting parked in front of a crib in the hood. An opportunity. By his telling, they ran through the hood, saw the car, took the car, and only weeks later did word get back through a girlfriend connection that the car belonged to Lil Zay. Wasn't personal. Was just inventory. Here's what to catch, because it's the key to reading this whole man. Even when Vaughn is admitting to something, look how careful he suddenly gets the second a specific, provable crime is on the table. The murders he'll narrate in the abstract all day. We killing them. I'm not telling you nothing. General. Unprovable. But the car suddenly belongs to somebody he be with. The pronouns get surgical. He'll brag about killing in general terms because general terms can't be charged, but he'll carefully place a specific, provable crime on somebody else's hands. That is not an accident. That is a man who knows exactly where the legal line sits and dances right along it on purpose. He is not actually reckless. He is calculated about which things he claims and which things he distances himself from. He just likes to look reckless, because looking reckless is the whole product. And here's the part Vaughn should sit with, and it has nothing to do with the courtroom. There's a reason the entire drill world should already know where this road ends. And his name was also Vaughn. King Vaughn. The South Side rapper out of O-Block. No relation, different side of the city entirely. But the cautionary tale that hangs over every drill artist who decides his realest move is to narrate his own life out loud. King Vaughn built a meteoric career on exactly that storytelling, so detailed, so specific about street violence that fans treated his songs like documentary. He talked openly and constantly about a life soaked in death. And in November 2020, he was killed at 26 years old, shot in a fight outside a lounge in Atlanta. His career barely 2 years old. The broader pattern is impossible to ignore, and every person in this scene has watched it play out over and over. The rappers who narrate the war the loudest tend to become the most visible targets in that war, and the most attractive subjects of a prosecution after it. Your words make you famous. Your words make you a name people want to take. Your words make you a defendant. The same mouth that built the brand paints the target on your back and opens the case file on the desk. The scene is full of ghosts who proved it. So when Vaughnoff 1700 sits in a chair and dares the law to do something about his confessions, he's not just gambling against the prosecutor. He's gambling against the entire recent history of his own genre. A history littered with young men who were the realest voice in the room right up until the day the realness caught up to them. Step back and look at the pattern across everything Vaughn does in public, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. The man's entire public persona is built on confrontation. And not by accident. It's a strategy. It's not just the gang war and the murder talk. It's the Lil Zay Osama car situation, where he positioned himself at the center of a beef with another established Chicago artist. It's 2025, when he got on Instagram Live and issued a public warning about NBA YoungBoy doing a concert in Chicago, telling the world YoungBoy wasn't going to cancel any show for any Chicago artist, tapping straight into the old tension between local Chicago artists and the outsiders who come through. It's the way he carries himself in interviews, never softening, never playing the diplomat, always the most hated guy in the room by choice. Every move is a confrontation. Every confrontation is content. And every piece of content feeds the brand. Here's why that's smart in a cold business sense, and why it's also a trap. In an attention economy, the fastest way to stay relevant is to stay in conflict. Beef is the most reliable engine for views the rapping internet has ever had. Bigger than the music itself, half the time. A new song might get you a bump. A beef gets you a whole news cycle. So a rapper who's always into it with somebody, a rival set, another artist, a visiting superstar, the whole West Side, is a rapper who's always trending, always in the algorithm, always being talked about. Vaughn understands this instinctively. He's not picking fights because he can't control himself. He's picking fights because attention is the currency and conflict is how you mint it. But here's the trap inside the strategy. When your entire brand is confrontation, you can never de-escalate anything without looking weak. And looking weak is the one thing the brand cannot survive. The peace movement? Can't join it. That's backing down. A rival flexing on you? Can't ignore it. That's taking a loss. A war that should have cooled off years ago? Can't let it cool. The heat is the product. The confrontation model locks you into a posture where every single situation has to be met with more aggression forever. Because the moment you stop being the most hated, you stop being relevant. And in this economy, stopping being relevant feels like dying. The strategy that builds the career quietly removes your ability to ever step back from anything. You become a man who literally cannot afford peace. Not just emotionally, because of the family he lost, but financially, because peace is off-brand. And that's the quiet horror of the whole Vaughn off 1700 story when you really look at it. He's not trapped by one thing. He's trapped by all of them at once. And they all point the same direction. The grief says stay in the war. The brand says stay in the war. The algorithm says stay in the war. The label's checkbook says stay in the war. The confrontation model says never back down from anything, ever. For different forces, for different origins, and every single one of them is shoving the same young man toward the same blocks where his friends keep dying. He could have every reason in the world to leave. And the entire structure of his success is built to make sure he never does. That's not a man making free choices. That's a man inside a machine that only knows how to do one thing. So what are the real consequences of all this? Let's break them into the 3 lanes these things always land in. Legally, the bet is still live and it's still dangerous. There's no marquee murder conviction hanging over Vaughn for the killings he talks about. If there were, this would be a completely different story. But he's a young man who's already had a gun case, who's tied to a scene where prosecutors are actively building RICO and gang cases out of social media and lyrics, and who keeps depositing evidence against himself one clip at a time. The loophole he's betting on has put a lot of guys exactly like him under the jail. He's young enough to think the bill never comes. The YSL defendants probably thought that too. On the streets, the consequences already came. And we already counted them. 3 of his own people in 6 weeks. That is what being into it with the whole West Side actually buys you. Not a crown. A funeral schedule. The street consequence of branding yourself the most hated set in the city is simple. The city hates you back with guns from a block away, and it doesn't care how many streams you've got. And on the family side, this is the lane that never trends. And it's the truest one. Every one of those 3 deaths has a mother, a grandmother, brothers and sisters, a whole family now living with a permanent hole in it. Moo Money's people have to carry the image of dropping him at a hospital door for the rest of their lives. Darian Yovan Rags has a family that lost a 13-year-old at the start of a summer. Michael's people lost him to a pill around a birthday. The clout machine moves straight on to the next viral clip. The grief does not move. It just sits in those houses and those chests and doesn't leave. And here's the part that ties Vaughn's whole psychology together. The part that explains why this engine never shuts off. He got asked about the peace movement, the one FYBJ Maine and Tay Savage made famous, where guys from genuinely opposite sides actually linked up on camera to try and stop the killing and put a better image out there for the next generation. And Vaughn's answer was a flat, instant no. He said he saluted them for trying. He's not knocking it. He respects the effort to give people something better to look at. But that's not him. He said he'd never sit down with his ops. He'd see peace with them in the afterlife before he'd ever shake their hand in this one. And then he said the realest thing in this entire story. He said it's different for him because he lost family. Not just friends. A lot of people lost homies. He said he lost family. That right there is the whole thing. Rewind all the way to the top. Strip away the hitman talk. Strip away the IG threats. Strip away the brand and the Columbia deal and the millions of streams. And at the very bottom of Vaughn off 1700, there's an 8-year-old boy who watched his uncle get murdered, who grew into a young man who's now lost more family and more friends to the same war, and who has decided, all the way down in his bones, that the only acceptable response to that much death is more death. That is not a flex. That is grief that calcified into a life sentence. He is not anti-peace because he's a monster. He's anti-peace because peace would mean forgiving the people who killed his blood. And he's simply not built to do that. The wound from when he was 8 never closed. It just grew up with him. And a man who genuinely cannot make peace, fronting a gang that multiplies its enemies every single time somebody dies, in a neighborhood where the ops live 1 block away in every direction. That's not a person in the conventional sense of someone making choices. That's a machine. And the machine can only ever produce one output. More of exactly what this whole story has been counting. For years, the entire Toss brand stood on 3 words: never took a loss. Vaughn said it in interviews, said it on live, built a whole most hated, never lost mythology on top of it. The internet runs on a claim like that. It's catnip. And the internet also lives to tear a claim like that down the second it shows a crack. In April 2026, it finally got its chance. Footage went viral of Vaughn and Toss in an actual shootout caught on camera, the kind of clip that flies across TikTok and YouTube in a matter of hours, reposted by a dozen drama channels before launch. The captions were all some version of the same thing. Vaughn off 1700 and Toss gang wild out shootout on camera. And the op it got attached to was Black Mob. The same 4-corner hustler cousins from way back at the start of this story. So the war that the OG on Facebook swore had died down is still very much breathing. And now it was on camera for the whole world to watch and rewatch. But the clip itself isn't even the real story. The reaction is the story. The second that footage dropped, rival figures piled on instantly, and the whole internet treated it like a crew that built its entire name on being untouchable had just gotten caught slipping on tape. That's the thing about building your brand on a claim like we never lose. All it takes is one piece of footage that looks like a loss, and the same algorithm that built you turns right around and makes you the punchline of the week. And to be precise here, because this is exactly where people invent things that aren't true, a viral shootout clip is not a body count. Nobody died in that footage. Toss did not lose in the sense of a person getting killed. What took the hit was the myth. The story of invincibility in a scene where perception is the entire currency. The perception flipped overnight. The Never Took a Loss gang became the guys getting clowned across every timeline. And that should tell you something genuinely heavy about this whole world. A gang can bury 3 real human beings in the summer of 2024, and the Never Took a Loss branding survives it without a scratch. But one clip that looks bad in 2026, and suddenly the whole internet declares them finished. That's how upside down the value system is here. Actual death doesn't dent the myth. Bad footage does. Because the myth was never really about staying alive in the first place. It was about looking like you're winning. The funerals were real. They didn't count against the brand. The loss everybody finally agreed to acknowledge was a video. So where does all of that leave Vaughn off 1700 right now? He's still here, still signed to a major, still dropping music, still doing the big interviews, still on live, still warning outside rappers about coming to his city. The career is real, and it's still moving. He took the most dangerous parts of his life and turned them into a product that a major record label pays for. By the cold metric of did the music work, it worked. The kid from the packed house in the falling apart neighborhood got on. But look at the price tag stapled to that success. Because the legacy of Toss up to this point is not a win column. It's a list of names. Michael, Moo Money, and a 13-year-old in the same neighborhood in the same weeks, whether he was ever connected or not. It's a frontman betting his own freedom that the law can't catch up to his mouth, while the law gets better at exactly that every year. It's a brand built on never losing, fronted by a crew that keeps losing the only thing that actually matters: people. And here's the choice that's actually sitting in front of him. The one this whole story has been building toward. Vaughn off 1700 has the one thing almost nobody in this position ever gets. A real way out. He's signed to a major. He's got national connections. The California EBK wave, the cosigns from Herbo and Polo, a fan base that stretches way past his block. He's got the money and the platform to physically leave the war if he wanted to. Most kids in this story never get that option. The streets close over them before any door opens. Vaughn's door is open. It's right there. But the door and the brand point in opposite directions. The brand says stay. The brand says the realness is the product. The war is the content. The danger is the value. And the second you leave the block, you stop being Vaughn off 1700 and start being just another rapper with a Columbia deal and a soft new sound. The market that made him is begging him to stay in the exact place that's killing his friends. And everything he said, the anti-peace stance, the family he lost, the 8-year-old who watched his uncle die, says he's not built to walk away even if the business led him there. So he's standing in an open doorway with the money to leave, telling the world he'll see peace in the afterlife before he takes a single step through it. That's the real cliffhanger of the story. Not whether Toss wins the war, but whether the one member with a way out ever actually takes it. Or whether the brand, the grief, and the block keep him standing exactly where the bodies fall. Step back from Toss for a second and look at the city around them. Because Toss isn't an outlier. It's a symptom. In July of 2025, in Chicago's River North neighborhood, a mass shooting outside a lounge during a rapper's album release party left 4 people dead and more than a dozen wounded. Different crew, different side of town, different specific story. But the same machine underneath. Music, a celebration, a perceived target, and gunfire that tore through a crowd. The city has been writing versions of this same chapter for more than a decade now, swapping out the names while the structure stays exactly the same. A new young artist rises off the realness of his block. The block's war follows him into his career. The career makes the war more visible, which makes it more dangerous. And somewhere down the line, somebody who had nothing to do with any of it catches a bullet meant for the noise. That's the context Vonoff 1700 sits inside. He's not a uniquely evil figure, and he's not a uniquely tragic one. He's one more name in a production line the city has been running since Chief Keef was on house arrest. The faces change every few years. The funerals don't. The neighborhoods that produce these stories, West Garfield Park, North Lawndale, Englewood, the whole belt of blocks the money abandoned 60 years ago, keep producing them because nothing underneath ever got fixed. You can sign every talented kid who comes out of there to a major label, and the blocks will just make more. Because the conditions that make the music are the same conditions that fill the graves. The label takes the art. The neighborhood keeps the body count. In an era where the biggest names in this scene are the ones with the realest street stories to tell, a kid like Vonoff 1700 had everything a viral career needs before he ever touched a mic. A wild personality, an inherited war 50 years in the making, and a willingness to narrate his own danger out loud for the camera. He didn't have to manufacture authenticity. His environment handed it to him for free, whether he wanted it or not. So of course the algorithm rewarded him. Of course a major label signed him. The machine pays the most money to the people standing in the most danger. That's not a glitch. That's the design. And that design is a trap with no clean exit. Because the content that builds the career is the very same content that ends it. Every week killing them live. Every hitman implication. Every interview where he flirts with confessing. That grows the channel and writes the case file at the exact same time. These young men are being asked to monetize the precise behavior that puts them in a cell or a casket. The platform profits. The label profits. The drama channels profit. And the kid posts his way toward either a RICO indictment or a funeral. And the painful truth is that both of those outcomes get more views than peace ever would. Nobody clicks on a video about 2 crews who squashed it and went home. The whole economy is tilted toward the bodies. Then there's the grief engine we mapped out earlier. Ops one block over in every direction. Alliances that multiply every single time somebody dies. So the war literally cannot end. It can only recruit new soldiers and new enemies with every funeral. That's not a Toss problem. That's a structural problem. A West Side problem. A Chicago problem. A machine that turns every act of mourning into a fresh batch of targets. Vaughn didn't invent that machine. He was born into it. And it reached out and grabbed him at 8 years old, standing there watching his uncle die. All he did was turn it into a soundtrack and put it on streaming. And underneath all of it, the branding, the beef, the viral clips, the trolling, the strangest part is what the numbers will never show you. A friend dead off a fake pill around a birthday. A 19-year-old left outside an emergency room because loving him out loud in that moment would have gotten his friends arrested. A 13-year-old shot in the head on a sidewalk at the very start of summer. 3 families that don't get a season 2. 3 holes that don't close. That is the real story of the many murders of Toss Gang. Not the murders they bragged about on camera. The ones the streets and the courts never proved, and this story never will. The funerals they kept attending. A gang that brands itself around death and keeps having to bury its own. Led by a young man who talks like he already survived the war that is, right now, still killing everybody around him. The title says murders. The evidence says graves. And in this city, those two words have meant the same thing for so long that a 13-year-old can die on the sidewalk, and the internet's very first question isn't why was a child a target. It's which set did he claim. Until that question changes, the only thing Toss Gang is guaranteed to keep doing is the one thing they've done best this entire time. Losing people. And that's what really went down. If this story made you think, drop a comment with what hit you hardest. And if you want more breakdowns like this, you already know what to do.